My name is Dr. Laura Landon. I'm chair of the philosophy department at Providence College. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our department to what I am now confidently able to say our second annual philosophy speaker. And I wish also to acknowledge contributions from the departments of biology and theology, as well as the development of Western civilization and liberal arts honors programs, without whose help this would not be so pleasant of an event. I'm delighted that Francisco Ayala from the University of California, Irvine is able to attend and speak with us. He is the university professor and Donald Bren Professor of Biological Sciences, Ecology, and Evolutionary Biology in the School of Biological Sciences, Professor of Philosophy in the School of Humanities, Professor of Logic and the Philosophy of Science in the School of Social Sciences. I've never met anyone who holds professorship status in 3 different schools, but he does. So we are most delighted to have him. His research, he's also got his PhD from Columbia University in 1964. He also has a PhD in theology. And for 2 years in the 1960s, he was a member of the biology department here at Providence College. And he is also a former Dominican friar. So this is his first time back. And those of you who have been here a while know that the campus looks much different now than it did in 1967. All of the area across the street of Huxley Avenue was part of the Chapin Hospital and not even part of the college at the time. Also, there were no female students at the time, only male. So his research interests, as he describes them, his research group has focused on the origin and evolution of introns, and on the evolution and functional significance of pseudogenes and ectopic expression, like I know what that means. Also, a long-standing concern of his has been the molecular clock of evolution. One of the ways of tracing evolutionary history is to look at the rate of mutations that occur in DNA, and the validity of those assumptions rests upon the accuracy or of the molecular clock. So he works on that. He has worked on the origin of malaria and other parasitic diseases. And in addition, he is interested in philosophy of biology and in bioethics, as well as in the relationships between science and religion, including the teaching of evolution in the schools. In 1981, he was a significant testifier in the state of McLean versus Board of Education in Arkansas. Was the State Board of Education had mandated that in science classrooms equal time be devoted to creation science and evolution science, and that law was found unconstitutional and largely in part of his testimony. On his faculty profile sheet for the University of California, Irvine, there are, under publications, 41 books and articles. May I point out that those are only the books and articles since 2002 to 2010. I think the server ran out of space for all of his publications for his entire career. But titles there range from alternative splicing, a missing piece in the puzzle of intron gain, like I know what that means. Darwin and the scientific method, I do know what that means. And most recently, this lovely little book, which I brought for show and tell because the cover is so great, Am I a Monkey? Okay, clearly written for the general audience, 6 big questions about evolution. So he has quite ranging interests and abilities. And where is number, I numbered everything here, so I'm looking for number 8. Oh, number 8, I did number 8, looking for number 9. Oh well. among his honors are, in 2001, President George W. Bush named him a recipient of the National Medal of Science. He is a member of and has been president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. All you bio majors who read Science magazine, that's the organization that publishes it. And in 2010, he was a recipient of the Templeton Prize. This is a very prestigious award given by the John Templeton Foundation to someone who has made an exceptional contribution to affirming life's spiritual dimension, whether through insight, discovery, or practical works. So Dr. Ayala will speak to us today on the foundations of morality, biology, culture, religion, ? And I am most pleased to turn this over to him. He'll speak about 50 minutes, and then we will have time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Landen. It's nice to be here, my old home. But at least for the students, when I was here, you were still in the mind of God at best. So it was, as Laura has said, Dr. Landen has said, 60 from the fall of 65 to the spring of 67. Anyway, it's very, very nice to be here, and she's a wonderful hostess. I was very pleased when she asked me to come. Our closest relatives are the chimpanzees. We are more closely related to the chimpanzees. This is our species, Homo sapiens, is more closely related to chimpanzees than chimpanzees are to the gorillas, or either one to the orangutans. The lineage that separates from the lineage going to the chimpanzees and goes to our species is called sometimes hominid lineage, or hominin in more modern language. So that separation happened about 7 million years ago. We have become very different, as it should be very apparent in more ways than one. And what I have done here is to list a few of the anatomical or morphological differences between ourselves and any other apes or monkeys or any other animal for that matter. So we have bipedal gait. Chimpanzees and gorillas walk through what is called knuckle walking. They rest on their knuckles, and that requires very long arms. We have an erect posture that entails many of the changes, but we also have a hand, which is a magnificent tool with opposite thumbs, which allows us to handle all sorts of objects, and indeed we can handle very small objects, very large objects. We feel temperature, roughness, and many other things. We have a large brain. Again, this is one of the most obvious differences between us and the apes. Chimps have less than 1 pound of brain, and the gorillas also closer to 1 pound. We have 3. We have jaws which are very reduced. You have ever observed them, I'm sure you have, in pictures or in zoos. The jaws of a chimpanzee or a gorilla protrude, particularly those of the gorilla, but also the chimpanzee are much larger. And we have a very different kind of face. All these are related, and although I'm not going to talk at any length today about the biological evolution of humans, it seems very likely, the best sort of a model that we have to explain what happened is that when our ancestors about 7 million years ago moved from the forest, from the tropical forest, very dense, to the savanna, they seem to have acquired very soon the erect posture. The fossils already of more than 6 million years ago show that our ancestors were, at least when they were on the ground, they already have a bipedal gait. That, of course, had as a consequence that the arms were no longer used for walking or for branching to the trees, which led to the evolution of the arm and eventually of the hand. At some point, our ancestors started to make tools about 2 million years ago with the species called Homo habilis. And I will mention what I'm going to say now. I will mention it again in passing a little later. But it seems to have been the critical step that led to the evolution of the large brain and to many other features of our species. So it seems that as a consequence of having had the evolution of the arms and the hands, our ancestors became dexterous at handling objects, but eventually, as I was saying, about 2 million years ago, to make tools. And the first association between hominids and tools is about 2 million years ago. Thereafter, the brain in size increases tremendously by a factor of 3 in just 2 million years, which is an enormous rate of evolution. What was going on, most likely, seems that for make tools, it's required that one has images of realities that are not present. We make a knife for cutting or an arrowhead for hunting, and that requires advanced intelligence, forming mental images of realities that are not present. And that seems to have been the critical step, the tool making in our evolution, because now those among our ancestors who were more intelligent, they're able to make more tools and better tools, and as a consequence, they reproduce better, they left a larger number of descendants, so that the genes that led to the increase in brain size continue to multiply over the following 2 million years until our species, which came only relatively recently, about 150,000 years ago or so. So these things are all related, the bipedal gait to the evolution of the hand, to the reduction of the jaws, which became necessary as a consequence of the large brain, because so that the head of the baby could pass through the birth canal of the mother, and that required a much smaller head in other parts. Imply also in that succession of events, of evolutionary events, was a slow development. Humans are born at a stage of development much earlier than the chimps or gorillas, or for that matter, any other mammal. And the reason for that has to do, again, with the size of the head, so that the human baby is much less mature. The brain is large, but the baby cannot wait, as it were, to have the brain fully developed, because then birth would be impossible. Another event that is associated with that is that the bones of our head, of our cranium, are not fused at the time of birth. They are in other primates, so that there is flexibility at the moment of birth. Now, I have added here this characteristic, cryptic ovulation, because it seems to have been the critical step in the origin of the nuclear family. We don't know when that happened. It probably was associated with some of the events that I have described, but it's fairly speculative, and I will not go into it. What is important, however, is to notice the implications. When a female primate goes into estrus, the external genitalia enlarge tremendously and acquire very bright color. The female is saying, I'm fertile. So the male mates, and there is absolutely no motivation from the point of view of the calculus of the genes for the male to stay there. Because if the female is fertile, fertilization occurs with probability much higher than 95%. So if a male were to stay there, will not be doing as well for his genes as trying to mate with another female. So runs away, looking for another female. But in human ancestry, at some point, that enlargement of the genital, the external genitals and the bright coloring of it disappears. So now the male doesn't know whether the female is fertile. So if he wanted to make sure that the babies that that female was going to produce were his baby, he had to stay there. So this is a reasonable explanation of how the nuclear family evolved as a distinctive feature of humans, of our species. And then there was some evolution of the vocal tract and larynx that had to do with possibility of verbal language, vocal language. I could have added here many other features, but those seem to me the ones which are most interesting among the anatomical differences between us and the apes. But now we come to behavioral differences, and of course the most conspicuous is our enormous intelligence, our exalted intelligence. I have listed 3 features of our intelligence. Abstract thinking, we are able to think in terms of abstract notions, that beauty or literature or what have you is part of our thinking and our language. We categorize, we see objects as member of general categories. We have an apple as member of the category apple, and this other one is a pear and is member of the category pear. And we reason. We make observations, we may use as premises to derive conclusion. All of these attributes are distinctively human, as I will argue briefly in passing, and they are expressions of our very exalted intelligence. We have symbolic language, which is creative. Some social insects communicate also with symbols. For example, the honeybee, if a bee is searching for food and finds a place where there's a lot of flowers with nectar, she flies directly to the hive and starts to make a dance in the shape of an 8, which is telling to the other bees where the source of food is, what direction relative to the sun, and how far it is or how abundant it is. And ants communicate symbolically also, but it's not creative language. It's all in their genes. Our language is creative, and it's creative in at least 2 important ways. We have an unlimited number of words. We can always create more and more words, and also we can create more and more sentences with those words. We have self-awareness and death awareness. We are aware that we exist as individuals. I'm going to make the outrageous claim that no other animal is aware that it exists as an individual. You know, when you have a dog, as I have, you know, it seems, as my wife says, it's very clear that he has a personality. He knows he's he and nobody else. Well, he doesn't. And the reason why I would claim that no other animal is self-aware is because no other animal has awareness of death. Self-awareness involves death awareness, because if I know I exist as an individual, then I see other individuals of my species who die. And if I see them dying, I anticipate that I'm going to die, so I'm going to treat them with respect, because I want to be treated with respect. Death awareness involves ceremonial burial of the dead, liturgical, ritualistic burial, and only humans practice that. We have tool making and technology associated, as I was saying, with Homo habilis starting to, first with Homo habilis starting 2 million years ago, but we have enormous technology which hardly needs to be elaborated. The point, science, literature and art, ethics and religion, social organization and cooperation, legal codes, and political institutions. Each one of these components would justify a good extended lecture, but the topic selected today at the suggestion of Dr. London was ethics. So let us talk about ethics. Philosophers often, or ethicists, of three different ways of looking at ethics. First, meta-ethics, why we ought to do what we ought to do, the justification of morality. Normative ethics, the moral norms, what we ought to do. And then practical ethics, how we deal with particular issues when a conflict, particularly when a conflict arises between different moral norms. There are numerous metaethical doctrines. I have listed here some. Moral realism. There's the claim that there are moral facts. There are things which are right or wrong by themselves. For example, not to kill. There are other doctrines which say that the reason why something is right or wrong has to be with the divine command. It's religion. God tells us what is right and what is wrong. There is a family of metaethical doctrines which I have represented here, mostly one of them, utilitarianism, which is what is good is morally good, morally right is good, maximize the good for the largest number, the good consequences for the largest number of people. This is part, as I said, of a family of theories sometimes called consequentialism, that morality, the value of moral acts is judged in terms of moral norms, in terms of the consequences. And then there is a positivism that says there is no rational foundations. We have moral norms because the political body, the social bodies, the government tell us what to do and not what to do. Many moral systems, including the traditional Christianity, actually have components of each one of these metaethical doctrines, and I'm using here Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican, the great theologian of all times, the greatest theologian, when he would say of all times. So we have a component which is God-given, but there is also a natural law, like not to kill or not to commit adultery, and there is also a source of moral norms which come from civil authority, the positivistic approach. With the publication in 1859 of The Origin of a Species, many philosophers, and more so scientists, thought that the foundations of morality now could be derived from evolution, from the evolutionary process. It was a way of thinking that didn't exist before. And I'm going to very briefly mention three individuals who wrote extensively about ethics. First, Herbert Spencer, a younger contemporary of Darwin, and then Julian Huxley and Waddington, C.H. Waddington, two great evolutionists of the middle of the 20th century. Herbert Spencer is very well known for many reasons. Mostly it's known negatively in almost all contexts. In this context, he argues that because evolution happens through the struggle for existence, competition, the strongest one wins. That is obviously the supreme norm of morality, says he, because that's what has accomplished the evolution and the progress that evolution has brought with itself. So that should be the supreme norm of morality. Let the strongest one win. Thomas Huxley, who was also a younger contemporary of Darwin, criticized Spencer, saying that from the fact that something is the case, even if evolution has happened that way, does not mean that it ought to be the case. That became known as naturalistic fallacy in 1903 by this philosopher, ethicist. The point had been already made by the great Scottish philosopher David Hume. Huxley and Waddington thought that they could avoid the traps, the traps that in which Spencer was entrapped, by pointing out that evolution is not generally progressive, But and therefore the struggle for existence is not supreme norm of morality. But clear we can see some lineages of evolution, some lines of evolution which are progressive, specifically human evolution. And therefore anything that favors the evolution of humans and of human attributes should be morally right, and anything that goes against it should be morally wrong. Well, they commit still the same naturalistic fallacy, although they thought that they were not. There is no grounds to justify what is happening in human evolution, or what may contribute to human evolution is by itself morally right. I am going to use now as my theme two quotations of Darwin. In The Descent of Man, the second most important of Darwin's book, that is After the Origin of a Species, published in 1871, he has a chapter, a full chapter dedicated to ethics, chapter 3, to morality, and then comes back to the subject in several other places. And I have picked up two quotations which convey the ideas that I'm going to try to convey to you also in the rest of the lecture. The first one is this, and you probably have read it by now. An animal with well-defined social instincts would inevitably acquire moral sense or conscience as soon as its intellectual powers had become as well or nearly as well developed as in man. What he's telling us is we are moral beings because we have an exalted intelligence. If some other animal would acquire that kind of intelligence, he would also be a moral being. This other statement is equally important and points out in a different direction. I do not wish to maintain that any strictly social animal, if its intellectual faculties were to become as active and as highly developed as in man, would acquire the same moral sense as ours. They might have a sense of right and wrong, though led by it to follow wildly different lines of conduct. What he's saying is, if we have an animal and becomes very intelligent, he's going to have a sense of right and wrong. He's going to have morality. But the contents of morality, the moral norms, could be different. And this is what I am going to be arguing in the rest of this lecture, that we are moral beings because of our exalted intelligence, but that the norms of morality do not come from our biological makeup, but from the evolution of culture, including religion. I should point out, since some of you seem to be puzzled as I was reading the text of Darwin, that Darwin didn't write those things with a Spanish accent. I added that for color. Anyway, these are the 2 points I want to make, or the 2 subjects I want to explore. Capacity for ethics, that is the inclination we have to evaluate some actions as either good or evil, as different from the codes of ethics, the norms by which we govern our actions. If you wish, that has to do a little bit with the traditional metaethics and this also with normative ethics. To clarify what I mean by this distinction, I will do this parallel with language, where I think the distinction is very clear. The capacity for language does not determine what language we speak. That's the same point I'm making here. The capacity for ethics does not necessarily fix what the norms of ethics will be, which were also the 2 points made by Darwin in the quotations that we have seen. So let me explore the capacity for ethics. I think we have a capacity for ethics because we have these 3 necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for there being moral behavior. The first is the ability to anticipate the consequences of one's actions, the ability to make value judgments, and the ability to choose between alternative courses of action. Let me say a few words about each one of them. Pulling the trigger is not a moral action. Pulling the trigger is a moral action if I know that they're going to shoot the bullet. which is going to kill my enemy. It becomes a moral action because of the consequences. Only if I can anticipate the consequences, then my actions can be judged to be moral, to have to be moral value. How did we acquire that? Well, remember tool making and the association of the development of intelligence with tool making. And so it is. Here I have what I was telling you before in words, in a sort of representation. We got bipedal gait, which led to the evolution of the arm and the hand. Then at some point, our ancestors went from just using tools to making tools, and that led to the enlargement of the brain for the reasons that I gave. Those who were more intelligent, and usually that implies a larger brain, were able to anticipate the future more, and therefore to make more tools, and therefore their genes would be multiplying, increasing frequency over time. And so a positive feedback loop happened there that led to our enormous brain and our enormous intelligence. It is necessary also for there being morality that we make value judgments. Because value judgments means you judge something as right, something as wrong. But we make value judgments of many other kinds. Aesthetic value judgments, something is beautiful, something is not, or gastronomic, we like this food and not the other food. Value judgments requires that ability that I mentioned earlier of categorization. In order to use, if I see this food, which is an apple, and I see this other one, which is a pear, immediately I know that I like this more than that, because I know this is an apple, belongs to the category of apples, and this belongs to the category of pears. So we form categories, and that way we evaluate the world around us and attribute value to them in one direction or another. With respect to the example of pulling the trigger, in order for pulling the trigger to be a moral action, I have to anticipate the consequence, but also think that killing my enemies is morally desirable or not. Of course, if it's going to be judged as a bad action. And finally, the third, the ability to choose between alternative courses of action, the third necessary condition, that's free will. If I have not the freedom not to pull the trigger, pulling the trigger would not be a moral action. Moral action requires that I have the choice, the possibility of choosing one way or of acting or another. The circulation of the blood or the digestion of the food, we don't consider them moral actions. Pulling the trigger is, if I have the possibility, obviously I have the possibility of pulling the trigger or not pulling it. That is, I have free will. Now, this is free will is a very difficult, complex philosophical problem, and I cannot go into it here. For the present purpose, I will say two things. First, that we all experience that genuinely we have free will. We really believe that we can choose among alternative courses of action. The most common objection against free will in recent times among philosophers, but also some physicists and others, is that we are made of atoms and molecules, and those are governed by the laws of physics. So if we are all atoms and molecules, we have the laws of physics and nothing else. Well, there's a fallacious argument in my view, not that everybody will accept this criticism, because here you have oxygen and here you have hydrogen. There are two gases and they have their own properties. Now they are mixed, and I have water, different properties. So the fact that because we are made out of something, we are nothing else than that something, is obviously fallacious, but I will leave it at that because I want to say a few words now about the codes of ethics, the norms by which we judge a particular action. I will remind you of the distinction by comparing it again with language. But what is the case, I will argue, is that the codes of ethics do not come from our biology. Our biology determines our exalted intelligence, and therefore the three properties that make us moral beings, ethical beings. But our biology, evolution, does not determine what the norms of morality should be by and large. It's not that there are no influences from nature, because cultural evolution takes into account the natural processes as well. So I would argue that the codes of ethics are, by and large, the result of cultural evolution, which is evolution, but follows very different rules and very different influences. It is evolution because we have the elements that are required for evolution's heredity, transmission of a trait, variation among individuals or among groups, and then differential reproduction, that is that some variants will reproduce more effectively than others. And there's natural selection. That's what is evolution. There is variation with respect to moral values in human populations. I would suspect that even in a group as homogeneous as the one, the people who are here, there would be differences with respect to some moral values. One hot item very often is, of course, abortion. Do you think that abortion should be allowed for the first week, for the first month, or never? And I think that there's a great variety of opinions about that, but about so many other things. Clearly, if we were to start to ask questions, to raise questions about all sorts of moral values, we would find that different people think different ways, even when, as I said, the group is as homogeneous as those of us who are here. There's certainly variation among groups. Different societies have different sets of moral values. We sometimes read with surprise that there are countries where, in Islam, for example, in many Islam countries, where sexual relations outside marriage are punished by death, and maybe a punishment is deserved or not, but maybe it is. But death seems somewhat exorbitant. We read, at least I remember reading about 4 or 5 weeks ago, a case of a woman in Pakistan. She had been raped, and the relatives wanted to kill her anyway because she had dishonored the family. It was not her fault, and nevertheless she deserved death according to these norms of morality. Clearly, great variation from groups to group, from group to group, and certainly from one time to another. We do not know much about the norms of morality of, say, of our ancestors of tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago, but clearly they were very different from ours in many respects. And even in historical times, we have considerations like the biblical injunction, grow and multiply and replenish the earth, which was taken for centuries as a sort of a command to have as many children as possible. In the modern world, there are many of us who think that we have a moral obligation not to have many children because we have a real problem of population explosion and so on with many other. Another that comes to mind, another example. When I was growing up, when I was the age of some of you here or younger, I don't have any idea whatsoever, and I don't think that anybody else among my friends or companions or others had any idea that we had a moral obligation with respect to the environment. You know, that you have to take care of the environment. You have certain variety of ways in which you may, and variety of ways in which you may not behave with respect to the environment. Now we are very conscious of that we must respect the environment. Well, I'm perhaps elaborating the obvious, pointing out there is variation from among individuals, among groups, and from time to time. And there is then selection. Remember, selection is differential reproduction, differential transmission of a trait. Assumes heredity and it assumes transmission of the trait, which, of course, we have it in culture. Culture is transmitted by imitation, by learning, by assimilation, which I will say in a moment what I mean by that. And take, for the case of monotheism, according to historians of religions, monotheism in the modest sense of one God, universal God, one God for everybody, omnipotent, benevolent, that notion came into Israel during the 7th century BC, that is, during the Babylonian captivity under the influence of some of the major prophets. Before Israel had its God, but other tributes had their own gods, and that's why they were not supposed to worship other gods. They worship only our own. Well, there are more than 3 billion people, of perhaps as many as 4 billion people in the world that accept monotheism in the modern sense that I have indicated. It's not because we are descendant from those Israelites who were in the captivity of Babylonia. It's for very other reasons, which is the cultural spread, cultural selection, and indeed, if we take, and still an earlier case, the Moses and the Ten Commandments are accepted now by the 3 monotheistic, the 3 Abrahamic religions. Again, not because we are descendants of the small tribe of Israelites that were living, trying to survive in the Sinai Peninsula under miserable conditions, and where Moses said, this is the law coming from God, and you have to observe it. And of course, he also said him, by the way, if you don't, you still violate the law, you may kill you. And don't think you can get away with it because God is watching you, or our God. Oops. One thing to notice about cultural evolution is that it is much, much more rapid than biological evolution. A new invention, it can be transmitted to the whole of humankind in 1 generation or less. To my freshman biology students, sometimes I ask, what do you think, what kind of cell phone your parents were using? And they're very puzzled, think about 1 minute or two, and then they say, oh no, they were not using cell phones. Well, that's the point, that now they all have cell phones and variations of it, but so with many other things. Any kind of invention, whether it is technological or cultural or whatever, can be spread to all of mankind in less than 1 generation. A biological mutation requires thousands and thousands of generations to spread throughout the species. Very importantly, the inventions or discoveries are directed mutations. In biology, mutations happen spontaneously with low frequency. Most mutations are deleterious. In the case of culture, the mutations, the inventions, discoveries, or accomplishments of art or literature, they are the ones we make them. We make them because we think they are good. Some may be more successful than others or not successful at all. But they occur at high frequency, Moreover, they are cumulative. Technology, but also literature and ideas or whatever is in culture is cumulative. You can have a change which is added, built upon previous changes, mutations upon previous mutations, as it were. Not so with genes. In the case of genetic mutations, when a mutation happens, an allele changes, if it is advantageous over relative to the pre-existing alleles, it will spread. The other ones will disappear. In cultural evolution, the process is cumulative. And then there is group selection. This is a technical point because by group selection we mean things that benefit to the group, but not necessarily to the individual. And the argument, of course, would go that something which is very good for the group, if the group prospers, then indirectly will be good to the individual, even if it calls for some cost. Well, in biological processes with interesting exceptions, group selection doesn't work. Because imagine for a moment that we have two groups of some animal, some insect or whatever, and in one group the individuals are all very cooperative, they help each other, and the other one they do not. So the first group is going to prosper and is going to increase much more and multiply and produce perhaps other groups than the ones where the individuals are antagonistic. It does not work in the long term because the first time you have a mutation among the good guys that makes them not cooperative, this mutation is at an advantage because the individual who has this mutation does not have to invest the cost the other individuals do in order to cooperate. So they don't have to cooperate, they don't have to invest that cost, but they benefit from the cooperation from the others. So the mutation will spread. However, group selection works in humans precisely and importantly because we have an exalted intelligence, we understand the benefits that can happen to us when we do things that are good for the group, they are good for society, and therefore we continue doing that. And that is has as a consequence that moral norms and moral values tend to be to readily spread. I'm going to end with this quotation from Darwin, which makes an important point, but it also indicates his optimism, moral optimism anyway, which not necessarily everybody will share. It's referring precisely to group selection and why it will work in humans if it may not work with other animals. A tribe, including many members who, from possessing in a high degree the spirit of patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage, and sympathy, were always ready to give aid to each other and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over most other tribes. Cooperation will help them to be successful, and this would be natural selection. At all times throughout the world, tribes have supplanted other tribes, and as morality is one element in their success, the standard of morality and the number of well-endowed men will thus everywhere tend to rise and increase. So not everybody, not all of us could share Darwin's optimism, but he certainly was a moral optimistic. So let me conclude by reiterating the main 2 points that I have made. Capacity for ethics is the result of biological evolution. Codes of ethics come from cultural evolution, including, of course, religion. Thank you.
There are microphones at the aisles. This is being recorded, so if you have a question, please approach one or the other of the microphones. And students first, if you have any questions.
Maybe we can pass the microphone around since it's not that easy to get out of the... Sure.
We'll see if we can. Get my exercise today.
Are you taking a suggestion?
No one has a question. Not a single question.
Doctor, I was wondering regarding your last point as to group cooperation and how in species that are not able to perhaps see the benefit for the entire group, they might be led, the individual might be led to undermine group cooperation by working for his own benefit and taking advantage of the group cooperation that is already established. And you said that, well, in the case of humans, we are aware of the social benefits of group cooperation. How would you answer a kind of Nietzschean critique that says, well, I'm just not sure if we are, or I'm not sure what kind of argument we can give to the individual that wants to precisely take advantage of the group cooperation that is already in place so as to be beneficial for him as an individual and for his, for perhaps his closest of kin.
Well, because leaving aside Nietzsche's pessimism and negativism in all relevant respects, all what is being said here is that you would see it. You don't need to be told about it, but you can see that if you do good things, that these things help others. And having a society that is prosperous, whether it's at the level of the family or larger group, the tribe or whatever, that also, by making the group more prosperous, that works to your benefit. It is true that in our society, if somebody goes around and starts to steal, can get ahead by breaking the law. But the proposition made by Darwin and by me is that most of us, we understand the consequences of our actions and therefore will not do that. Of course, we also have society trying to penalize the persons, the individuals who do not behave properly.
To follow up Luis's question, among animals, are there, say there was a genetic mutation so that some individual does not fool the, sort of a free rider, gets advantages but doesn't follow the rules. Does the colony or whatever have some mechanism for reacting against that and enforcing their rules?
Well, what I was implying that in animals in general, group selection doesn't work precisely because there is no way of enforcing the negative behavior. Now, social animals is quite a different story because in social animals, cooperation among individuals occurs for genetic reasons. Again, to simplify a very complex story, which gets complex, more and more complex every day, but if you think of a bee, the bee is a female, has two sets of genes. She's the daughter of the queen, which has two sets of genes, and a male which has only one set of genes. That leads to the following counterintuitive consequence, that the sisters are more closely related to each other than they are to their mother or their mother to them. In other words, the daughters of the queen have 50% of the genes in common with each other, I mean in common with the mother, because they have inherited half of the genes from the mother and half of the genes from the father. But the genes that they inherit from the father, they are all the same. So the sisters have 75% of the genes in common, which is why there is only one queen, or very few, depending on the case, because natural selection favors the sisters, the sterile behavior, rather than favoring the genes of the individual who is a reproductive individual. The queen is transmitting only half of her genes to each daughter. The daughters have half of the genes in common with her, and once again, however, they have 3/4 of the genes in common with each other. So the genes will favor being sterile under those conditions, which seems so counterintuitive. But in most other animals that doesn't happen, there is no punishment usually in families of animals or in tribes or groups or troops. And that's why group selection doesn't work. I think there was...
Ayala.
Yes.
You've been speaking about, well, conventional or less pleasantly heard morality, but anyway, the kind of morality that exists all over the place. It varies a lot, but it has two basic principles. Care for insiders, particularly young and vulnerable ones, infants, and bash outsiders, people who by their acts or their origins are outside the group. The outsiders may be killed, imprisoned, mutilated, tortured, and have a number of other unpleasant things done to them. Does your account give us any reason to believe, or even any reason to believe that ought to be the case, that we should have a wider sense of we and a narrower sense of them? It would seem to me that the mechanisms you're talking about would, if anything, tend toward a narrower sense of we and a wider sense of them.
Yeah. Well, that's very well said. We tend to favor first the members of our immediate family, our relatives, or not so immediate, among other reasons for genetic reasons. Because genetics, our genes, the ones we have, are genes that have been established there as a consequence of cooperation among members of the family. But if you go now to the moral values themselves, again, most systems of morality that have evolved through time take into account the degree of relationship. Families come first, the tribe comes next, but my tribe is better than I have more obligations with to my tribe that I have to another tribe. But still, there is the consideration of the benefits that happened to me if if I behave well with respect to others. But that is not, I am not implying, and that does not imply that you exercise the same degree of dedication, as it were, to all individuals independently of relationship.
Okay, well, I'm still formulating my question, but thank you very much. It was very thought-provoking. I have my doubts that intelligence can be traced back through evolution. I mean, in other words, I think that what we can do can't be explained by what evolution can do entirely. You seem to think that we can reduce intelligence or our abstractive abilities back to some sort of biological activity, which can be explained by evolution. But even setting that aside, or I'd like to get your considered thoughts on that, but the question I'd really like to, or I'd like to think out loud with you is, does it make sense then to even have a meta-ethics if ethics arises the way you say it does? Because a society, through cultural selection, chooses a set of moral norms. Can we then, looking from the outside, say, those aren't very good moral norms? If they work, then is it possible, in other words, for a set of moral norms to work? In other words, evolutionarily, but still to be morally defective. And I think that gets at the sense of morality, which I find that your account doesn't really put its finger on.
Good point. It's not implied that any moral system is perfect. If they would be perfect, there would be no evolution of moral systems. And I think there can be no doubt that through the history of humankind, you see it today also in tribes of relatively not very civilized peoples, that they have moral systems which are very different from one tribe to another. And we obviously, I mean, mankind has evolved its moral systems through time. But again, that does not mean that any moral system is perfect. They are not. If anything, by definition, because there are different ones, do they keep improving?
I like the way you put that, because that helps me now to ask a pointed question. What is the measure then of what makes a moral system a good moral system as to an imperfect one? Or what is the standard of, again, this comes down to the same question I asked before, what is then the standard of morality? Because you seem to be saying it's not just cultural evolution, it's not just well, what is it?
Yeah, well, you are referring to two different things. First you say, how do you measure standards of morality? And there is no rule to measure standards of morality unless you do it within a cultural context. You know, they take Christianity. Even within Christianity, we have different ways of thinking. Even within the Catholic Church, we have somewhat different ways of thinking from one place to another. Even with respect to moral values, we tend to agree to some of the most fundamental values. But I was implying by referring to that hot button issue of abortion, that even there, you know, people would think that it is morally right to kill the baby to save the life of the mother, than to kill the embryo, the fetus. And other people who would say, no way, you cannot do that. Those, of course, are questions of applied ethics, but what I'm referring is the moral values implied, which are different in different people. Now, so there's one thing. We have no absolute standard through which we can measure the achievements of morality and say this society is more moral than the other one, have gone farther. But the moral systems have evolved, it seems to me, obviously have evolved by cultural process. I mean, the cultural evolution can be so dramatic, and perhaps the most dramatic example that comes now to my mind is the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity. You know, the Christians, they have moved, and in many converts, they have made many converts also in Rome, in the Roman Empire. They were living in the catacombs. They were being persecuted until Emperor Constantine, under the influence of his mother on the year 325, declared the Roman Empire Christian. And overnight you have, you know, most of the Western world, at least the culturally known Western world at the time, but perhaps millions of individuals become Christian. Just one genetic mutation, as it were, not genetic, a cultural mutation had spread to much of mankind just overnight, so to speak. So norms of morality evolve culturally by following cultural rules. But we don't have any good way of, I don't think we have a good way to determine which system is better than which other one.
There's a question a couple rows back at the top of the view.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. As I understood your talk, intelligence is an emergent property. Let's see. Apparently there's a party we're unaware of. Intelligence is an emergent property that comes out of evolution, if I understood your argument correctly. Does that mean that there is a qualitative distinction then, right? So we are different in kind in such a way that then allows morality to emerge. And if that's the case, my first question for you is, can we make any arguments for morality that are analogous to, I guess, what we would call now brute nature?
The what nature?
Brute nature.
Oh, brute, okay. Yeah. Well, I would not use the language that you were using, that speaking of morality as an emergent property, but I think what the content of what you, the way you have expressed it is what I have been trying to convey. Yes, it's a consequence of evolution that we became very intelligent, and because we are very intelligent, we understand the consequences of our own actions, and also are able to make value judgments and to have free will, and the foundations of morality. So I'm saying we are moral beings because we are very intelligent, and we are very intelligent as a result of evolution. Although, of course, the point was made that somebody was saying earlier that he's not convinced that intelligence comes about all by evolution. I'm willing to argue that point, and that, by the way, will not probably imply negating anything that you have in mind. I was somewhat reluctant to undertake that part of your question because it can go for another hour as another lecture. But let me tell you why I see no problem with accepting that intelligence has evolved and still accepting the presence of God and the actions of God, if that's what was in your mind. Well, so it happens that some 30 years ago, maybe a few more, you were one single cell in the womb of your mother. And what a miracle, out of a single cell, by natural processes, it divides into two, into four. There we have a human being with a lot of intelligence. There was no intelligence there. No intelligence there. So your intelligence has come about by natural processes. That at no point implies denying that you are a creature of God, that you are a person of faith. But the intelligence has come by natural process. If it can come by natural process to you, why could not come by natural processes to the whole species? That's sort of the kind of argument that I am elaborating. You have a question here? Oh, yeah. You can use the mic. You have it right here. They put it because they knew you were going to ask a question. Oops. Oh, I have lost something.
I'm on the spot now. Okay. From what you've said, it seems as though like cultural evolution is working towards us and like with us intellectually, culturally, and religiously so far. Do you think there's going to be a point where it's going to work against us?
Very, very interesting question. Very good. We only can make it work against us if we do it ourselves to ourselves. And one would hope that we have enough sense as a society or as a species, if you wish, to never self-destruct. But where in the years somewhat before you were born, there was a lot of concern in this country and in other parts of the world that maybe mankind will annihilate itself. Because it's the nuclear war we had started, say, between Russia and the United States, mankind could have disappeared. We had more than enough, nuclear weapons to kill every human being on the planet. We could kill ourselves also by abusing the environment to a point where we can no longer live. But I am, like Darwin, a moral optimist, and I think that we go through these difficulties and somehow we always seem to overcome and be able to correct course so that we keep improving. So it remains to be seen, but what is the difference between an optimist and a pessimist? That the optimist, like myself, I think that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and you as a pessimist are afraid that I may be right. No, I think we, we have enough ability to self-correct, so that we would not destroy ourselves. There is a question there. Two. Okay.
I have a, you mentioned in regards to non-human animals, some interesting exceptions to where cultural selection and cultural evolution exist, some unfigured out problems. Do you have an example that might be interesting to consider, for us to consider or to look at?
Yeah. I may not have communicated well, because I do not think that animals have culture properly so, in the sense that I was using it when applied to humans.
Group selection facts.
Well, again, I was saying that group selection doesn't work with animals. You know, there is the appearance of group selection in social insects. This is all the calculus of the genes.
Thank you for your talk. My question is, your Darwinian story seems to carry with it well, let me put it this way. It seems to me that the existence of God is very compatible with the story that you're telling, but it's also very, it's a hypothesis that isn't necessary either, that I could see what you're doing as working with somebody who is a theistic believer, but also somebody who has no interest in that hypothesis could probably sign on to what you're talking about too. And it seems to me that in many ways Darwin's own theory is carries the same sort of possibilities. Am I right about that?
Yeah, you are quite right. But this, as the example that I was using before, you take an individual coming from an egg fertilized by an ovule fertilized by sperm, and out of that cell eventually emerges a full individual. It's a purely naturalistic description, and we are all willing to accept that. A person of faith may think that it's a creature of God and that God is present there. But certainly, scientifically, there is no need for that hypothesis. As you put it, you know, a person of faith will believe in that, but you don't need it. And there is nothing in science that's going to tell him or you or me that you know, that somehow God has been present in all that process. Yeah, I, however, think, and now that we are at it, I will say it, because I have written a book about it, that evolution and Darwinism is perfectly, well, is consistent with the Christian faith, Christianity, and I believe that creationism, so-called creationism, and intelligent design are not. So I have a book that Laura has that says Darwin's gift to science and religion. I think evolution helped us to deal with many problems which were very difficult to explain without evolution. Essentially the problem, I mean, some of the dimensions of the problem of evil.
Yeah, it seems to, well, not it seems to be, but human intellect itself grows very, very slowly over sort of millions of years, and that our species gets smarter very slowly. But cultural achievements happen relatively quickly compared to that. If we assume for a second that we have some form of, you know, true hard artificial intelligence that, you know, is capable of, you know, independent and rational thought, but is capable of achieving in 30 years the same level of growth that happened to humanity over 1 million years, do you think within that entity or series of entities, morality would sort of progress proportionally or significantly faster because of that increase in intelligence, that rapid intellectual increase?
I don't think those entities will have morality, but I don't think those entities will, I don't think they will have the characteristics that you seem to imply. You know, I think ultimately will be robots manipulated by us, and they will have the properties that we put in. Technology will increase, as it continues to increase at an accelerated rate, and handling of information systems will increase. But I think morality will be with human beings, not with the machines. Not everybody agrees with that, but that's my point of view, and I'm prepared to defend it, but not enough time to do it here. Oh.
I just have one more question, and it's regarding those 3 conditions for the capacity for ethics that you established. Do you think that it would be possible not just to derive the capacity for ethics, but to derive some kind of bare bones ethics in the kind of way in which I'm thinking of the language as kind of an analogous process? We may be able to, there are certain features that seem to be common to all languages, certain very simple grammatical structures, the capacity to refer, and maybe if there is an analogous capacity to have a very bare bones.
Yeah, quite right. I think that is reasonable to accept that killing is morally wrong, and many other things are morally wrong in themselves. So I'm not saying that nature does not contribute to the norms of morality. What I'm saying is even when they have a base on nature, still culture elaborates them, and they keep changing or being modified and accepted to a larger or lesser extent. So, but yes, I suppose you could. I would go along with the moral realist saying that yes, there are some facts in the moral world which come from the objective world that makes sense to consider them as moral facts, not just something that is superimposed by us.
To follow up on that, then the person that is trying to use evolution, and by here I mean natural evolution, not just and not then the subsequent cultural evolution, to try to go further than the capacity for ethics, and to try to determine more to a lesser or more or less extent normative claims, not just the capacity for ethics. And you seem to admit at least very bare bones things like murder we may be able to derive. Where do you think the person should stop? Or are you just skeptical of our ability to reason out every single norm? Or are we just to take those basic norms and those may be able to be derived by nature, but at what point in the process?
I think like in biological evolution, in cultural evolution, the process is ongoing. And there is no reason to think there is a point at which it's going to end in all relevant respects. I mean, biologically, some traits don't change for millions of years, others change, and different organisms change at different rates. And a parallel to that can be seen in cultural evolution. These norms of morality can be changing, but and are changing and do change, but there's not necessarily a point at which they stabilize themselves. There may be notions or norms of morality that we think we have achieved as much as we can possibly achieve as a society or as a species. But in principle, there's no reason why things cannot be getting better and better morally.
I just meant, and that'll be the end. I didn't mean a stop to the process of evolution. I meant the process of trying to derive particular normative claims from those 3 premises. That's what I meant. You might say murder might be an acceptable inference. The prohibition of murder might perhaps be an acceptable inference from those 3. Why not go further in terms of our intellectual project, not in terms of the cultural evolution, and where might it be?
Okay, let me see whether this will help in conveying what I think. Think again of language. Those 3 properties give us the 3 capacities, the capacity to be moral beings. We also have the capacity for language. Those do not determine the norms of morality would be. The same way as the capacity for language does not determine the language we speak. And of course, languages keep changing. And the parallel is only up to a point. Clearly, morality does not evolve at the same rate as language, but the parallel exists. I mean, it's a valid comparison, I think.
I just meant to say, there are common features in languages. That are we to agree on this? That there are common features in language that even to call it a language, that assumes certain common features.
Yeah, like the moral facts that I was referring to. In morality, there are moral facts.
Yes, but then what I meant to say is, where do we go in terms of when does it cease to be common and becomes particular to each language or to each system of ethics? We don't know.
The same as with language, yeah. I think.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ayala.
Thank you.